Alright, today we begin with Tokugawa Japan, which is roughly the time period between 1600 and 1868 AD. This is a period of strength and stability and adaptation for Japan. Basically, what happens during this time period is the Japanese really start to figure out what it is to be Japanese. And so they're really thinking about their national consciousness of what it means to be Japanese, of what constitutes being Japanese. So one of the things that they go back to is their native religion, which is Shintoism. And there's this huge Shinto revival as people begin to rediscover their native religion. The government structure is very, very Japanese. You have the shogun at the top, followed by the daimyo. And then they add councils and chamberlains as well. There is going to be a secret police that's kind of monitoring the people. They watch and they listen for any rebellions that might be taking place, that might take the leading family or the leading shogun out of power. Now, the economy during this time is really developing. We'll see the development of roads and inns along these roads, and so there's going to be more commerce available. But the reason these roads develop is because of something called alternative attendance. The enemies of the emperor were sent to the farthest reaches of Japan, basically to get them out of his hair. But they were required to come to the capital for certain periods of time, basically to make sure that they're behaving themselves. Their families are going to be kept in the capital city as sort of collateral for good behavior. As long as they behaved well, their family would be treated well, sort of thing. Now, all the daimyos had to do this, but the enemies had to do it more often. So all the daimyos had to come visit the capital for a certain amount of time and at certain times of the year. But the ones that were considered problems had to do it more frequently, and this kept them traveling a lot. And if you're traveling, you're not going to be busy planning a rebellion. So that's kind of the philosophy behind it. But because they're doing all this traveling, they need to have good roads to travel on. They're going to need to have places to stay, because remember, they're staying at the very farthest reaches of Japan. So they're going to need to have some place to stay on their journey. And then they're going to need supplies, and they're going to want to buy things for their family when they visit them and all kinds of stuff. So it is a boost to the economy as well. Now, the peasants are going to develop handicrafts to sell to the daimyos as they are traveling, and they diversify a little bit. They create pottery, and they begin growing mulberry trees, which is important for silk, and so they begin to, come up with an income of their own. The merchants are going to capitalize on this as well. The two main cities of Osaka and Edo are going to be kind of like banking centers, sort of. They have a lot of banks and a lot of trading houses. And that's because these two cities have a lot of economic interest in a lot of different areas. And what's going to kind of develop as a subculture in these two cities is something called the floating world. And this floating world, this concept behind it is that life is temporary, so you should enjoy it while you can. And so it offered all of these luxury things, like the geisha is going to develop in this floating world. And the geisha are women who are paid to entertain men who didn't have their wives with them. Bunraku theater, it's a puppet theater. The haiku, woodblock prints, it's a new art that depicts reality. All these things are going to be available in the floating world, and they're considered luxuries that most people didn't have the time to do these things. But what this does is this economy grows, and there's more money for more people, and so the standard of living in Japan is very good at this time. And so they're doing quite well. They are being very successful. Japan is fairly isolated, and eventually it will have some Western contacts with European countries. In 1632, the Western countries began making their first forays into Japan, and the Western countries aren't invited to come to Japan. Trade's not that important to them, so foreign ships aren't going to be allowed to dock. In fact, Japan is going to pass a ban on building ocean-going ships. They only wanted to trade with like China and the other Asian countries. They didn't really see a need to trade elsewhere. They got everything that they wanted from China. China has lots of resources, all kinds of stuff. But eventually the Japanese are going to keep their relations with China, they'll keep it with Southeast Asia, and they are going to include the Dutch. And the reason they include the Dutch is because the Dutch don't care about religion. They're not trying to spread Christianity, because for the Japanese, Christianity conflicts with the idea of the emperor. Remember, the emperor is descended from Amaterasu. Well, if Amaterasu doesn't exist, then the emperor isn't a spiritual guide, and it just causes a bunch of issues for them. Now, the Dutch didn't just have free reign in Japan. They're allowed to come to one port, which is Dashima, and they could only have 1 or 2 ships a year. And the reason the Japanese allowed the Dutch to come in is so that they could get gossip about what's happening. They want to know what's going on in the rest of the world. They're curious people. They just don't want to have all the baggage that comes with that. So they very much limit their contact with the Western influences. And in addition to that, colonialism is just not something Japan wants to get caught up in. They've looked, they've heard the gossip from the Dutch, and they've seen what happens when you let the Westerners in. They're friends with you for a while, but then after a while they come in and they take you over. And the Japanese just don't want any part of that. It's not something that they want to get messed up in. Well, the decline of the Tokugawa is going to begin in the 1830s, and mostly it's because the Tokugawa Japan time period is going to lose its flexibility. It no longer learns how to adapt and change. That used to be its strength, and so it loses its flexibility, it loses its ability to adapt. In addition, there's a lot of financial demands in Japan at this time. Basically, Japan wants to aim at a static society, meaning that people stop migrating to the cities. If you stay where you're born, you don't move around. They also are having problem with taxes because most of the peasants pay taxes in kind, which means that they would pay their taxes on their rice with rice, or their taxes on their livestock with the livestock. They didn't actually have coins to pay, so they would pay in kind. Well, that's just another step for the government to take to try and get money. In addition, the tax amounts, the assessment value for their tax amounts were the same as they were 200 years ago. There hadn't been any changes, and because of that, the government's going bankrupt because they're still getting the same amount of taxes that they did 200 years ago, but their expenses have exploded. So it's kind of a problem. The Japanese also are going to start taking out national learning, elements that aren't Japanese, so things that were Chinese or Korean or Western are going to be kind of thrown out of school curriculums. And again, it's that failure to adapt, a failure to be flexible. Incomes will rise. Their taxed income is going to not include things that probably should have been included. Things like rice and mulberry trees and salt mines and natural resources are not included in their taxable income. And so the government's missing out on this huge thing that it could be making a profit on, or at least getting taxes from, and keeping them out of debt. But that doesn't happen. So people's incomes continue to rise, but the government's not seeing any of that money. Ability versus heredity is going to be a huge issue for the Japanese. It seemed for the Japanese that those who were the most able, those that had the most abilities, had the least power, and those that were the least able had the most power. And so it's a huge issue of, well, you have all this ability, but because you weren't born into a samurai family, or you weren't born into a daimyo family, or you weren't born to the emperor's family, you're not going to get anything. So that's a huge issue for them. So when we look at the balance sheet of who's happy in Japan during the end of the Tokugawa, about the 1830s, 1840s, the emperor, he's not really happy. He doesn't really have any real power. He's very limited on his freedom because he's supposed to be spiritual guide and protected, so he doesn't have a whole lot of freedom or power. The shogun? No, he's not really happy either. He's in debt to the merchants because he's overspending, so he has to take out loans from the people who have the money, which is the merchants. And there's a real fear about other people coming in and taking over. What about the daimyos? Well, no, they also have debt. They also have no power and really no access to it. In some ways, yeah, they're doing okay because the economy's good, but they're also in huge debt. The samurais, no, they're not happy. They also have debt. They got to pay for all that weapon and training and being gone from their families to fight in wars and stuff. And that's a lot of money going out the window. The peasants, depends on who you are. Some of them that were really poor, they're not happy. Others that are doing well along the trade routes and are selling off items that they create, yeah, they're doing okay because the economy's doing good and people have money to spend, so they have some money. Artisans, kind of same thing. Some are dirt poor, others have found an avenue to get some money, like if you were a geisha or you were a creator of woodblock art or you made haikus, that was a way for you to get some money. And the merchants, nah, they might have a lot of money, but they don't have any power because of it. It doesn't give them any power, and they don't have any access to power. It's not like they can suddenly become a daimyo or anything. So really in Japan at this time, it's a great time period, but nobody's happy. So obviously something's going to be happening. Well, the Tokugawa will attempt to make some reforms. First off, they decide, well, let's just cancel all the debt that has accumulated, which is great for the daimyo, it's great for the shogun, it's great for the samurai, but it sucks for the merchants. The merchants are super unhappy about this because they lose their money. It's not like they get money back. The debt is canceled. They get nothing. Well, it doesn't mean that the daimyos are suddenly making money. The samurai aren't suddenly making money. The shogun's not suddenly making money. They still have to spend money, and now they still need to take out loans, so they go back to the merchants. And they need to borrow again. And the merchants are like, well, this time we're going to charge you a really high interest rate because it sucks that we don't get our money back. You screwed us over the first time. Well, so they do. They raise the interest rates and they take out more loans. So that didn't do any good. Well, then the Tokugawa thought, well, maybe we'll just cut government expenses. Let's cut the military. So let's cut the samurai. Let's get rid of some of them. Well, now the samurai are out of jobs. And now they're accumulating debt. And now they got to go to the merchants to take out more money. So it's kind of a never-ending cycle here. The next attempt to modernize or to reform is going to be modernization. Let's just upgrade everything. Well, doing that's expensive. So again, got to take out money, high interest rate. Merchants are very unhappy with you. So it does cause some issues. It causes some problems. Well, eventually in Japan, what we're going to see is some internal pressure is going to meet with external pressure in Japan. And what that means is that you have the views of the West about the Western European countries. How they view China is how they're going to view Japan. Basically, very negative relations with the West, with China, because China kind of gets the short end of the stick on this. Most everybody in Japan is looking at what's happening in Asia with the West, and they're like, oh, this is just not good. The Vietnamese are going to be dominated by the French. India is going to be dominated by the British. China is going to have very bad relations with the West, all Western nations. And then the Japanese are going to be approached by the United States. Commodore Matthew C. Perry goes to Tokyo and he begins to establish relations between the United States and Japan. And basically, he challenges the Tokugawa and says, can you protect your people? The rhetoric, or what everybody believes, is that the government is supposed to protect the people. But the reality is that the government's not capable of protecting its people. It's in debt. It has no money. It hasn't modernized. It hasn't kept up with times. It has isolated itself. It has no real allies. So the belief, the rhetoric is that the government is supposed to do it. The reality is the government's incapable, cannot do it. So what will happen is you'll get two different opinions among the Japanese people. The Keikoku believe that the Japanese need to modernize. We need to open our ports to the United States. Let them in. They'll help us out. We can become stronger that way. The Joy is going to say we need to keep foreigners out because we know what happens when they come in. People get dominated, and that's not going to help. Well, basically, Matthew C. Perry is going to force them to sign treaties for trade with the United States. So in 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa is going to be signed, and the Japanese call it the unequal treaties because there's really no negotiations about it. The West has a list of what they want, and Japan is expected to give in to all the demands. So they didn't really get much of a say in this. In 1858, the Harris Treaty will be signed, and the Harris Treaty wants everything that the Treaty of Kanagawa had, but they want additional ports, they want control over the tariffs, And they want extraterritoriality, which means that the laws from their home country work in Japan. They don't have to follow Japanese laws. So again, it's more in favor of the West than it is in favor of the Japanese. Well, because the Tokugawa is agreeing to all this, there is a challenge to the Tokugawa family. Other daimyo families are going to come on and say, hey, this is not good. You just keep on giving in everything. I think we can find something better to do. And so in 1862, the Satsuma family is going to assassinate a Westerner. And they're basically hoping for some retaliation so that this war starts and the treaties are history, so that they aren't in effect anymore. And it doesn't work. In 1863, the Choshu family is going to basically set up weapons on the Straits of Shimonoseki, and they start bombing the boats that come through. Again, hoping to start a war that's going to eventually cut off relations with the West. Eventually, that doesn't happen either, and so a war in 1866 is going to break out, and it's not a war with the West. Instead, it's a civil war in Japan, and the whole purpose is to get rid of the Tokugawa family. And so that's what's going to usher in the Meiji era, where they get rid of the Tokugawa.